Welcome to Dev Dive In. Today you become a painter, but with code. I'll give you a step-by-step guide on how to style your website. We'll go over the absolute basics of CSS so your mom can finally pin your beautiful website on her fridge. Let's have a look at what we'll be building today. Let's cue the overproduced demo. Now we know what we're building, let's dive in. First we'll need to know what CSS is. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. So what does that mean? Cascading we'll get to in a bit, but style sheets, if you think of your web page like a book, the HTML provides the structure and content of the book. It defines the headings, the paragraphs, the images. Now what a style sheet does for you is it allows you to define what those elements look like in one place, and throughout your entire book, they'll pick up that style. So if you want your headings to be big and bold, you define it in the style sheet, and every time a heading is in your book, it'll pick up that styling. So in a nutshell, CSS is your look and feel for a website. It makes your web pages more visually engaging and enjoyable for the user. Remember that word cascading, the C in CSS? So we're going to need to explain a little bit about CSS in order to describe what that is. First up, you're going to have to learn a little bit about a thing called CSS selectors. As you can imagine, HTML documents can get pretty complicated. They can have thousands of elements in each page, and CSS uses selectors to be able to pick out what it needs to style. I'm going to go over all the selectors so you know what those are. First up is the element selector. This allows you to style a group of elements. So say I wanted to style all the H1s. So I can use an element selector to do that. So as an example, I would just type H1, an opening curly brace, and a closing curly brace. Anything in between those curly braces is the styling for all H1s. Another example might be all paragraphs. So I would start with a P, an open curly brace, a closing curly brace. Anything in between those curly braces is going to affect all paragraph tags. That's great and all, but what if we don't want to style all paragraphs, but only a select few? That's where the class selector comes in. So on any HTML element, we can add a class attribute and be able to reference its value in our CSS selector. So as an example, we had a class of cool dude. In CSS, we can create a selector by adding a dot and then cool dude, an opening curly brace and a closing curly brace. Anything in between there is going to affect any HTML element that has a class of cool dude. This is not just paragraphs. It can be an H1, it can be an image, it doesn't really matter. It's looking at the class attribute. So say we want to reference a single element on our website, and that's where our third selector comes in, the ID selector. So how the ID selector works is it allows you to select an HTML element that has an ID with a specific value. So if I had an element that with an ID of kittens, then in my CSS, I can add a hashtag kittens, opening curly brace, closing curly brace, and anything in between would style that element. Now it is technically possible to have two elements with the same ID, but best practices says that each ID should be unique. It wouldn't be much of an identifier if they're all named the same. Lastly is the attribute selector. It's very similar to the class and ID and how it works. After all, a class and an ID are technically an attribute. Those selectors are just more commonly used, so they have shortcuts for them. The attribute selector is a little different in its syntax. So as an example, say we wanted to add a style to any link that had an href of a certain URL. Have an A tag, then square brackets, and in between, you would write out the attribute as you would see it in HTML. So in this case, the href, then an opening curly brace, and then a closing curly brace. Anything in between would style the anchor tag that has an href of that URL. You can mix and match these tags to select any element that you want on the website. Now this can lead to an issue where two selectors are selecting the same element and which one takes precedence over the other. And that's where the C in CSS comes in. Cascading is how CSS deals with these conflicts. CSS uses specificity to apply its styles. So first it's going to start with the most general rules. So the element rules like P would apply its styles first, and then it would go to the classes, and apply those styles. Any styles that are the same, it would take a class version over the element because it's more specific. And lastly, it would take the ID, the most specific of them all, and apply those rules over top of the other ones. So it's cascading down. Now we've been styling the text using this color CSS property, and we're just going to go over what a CSS property is and the overall structure of it. So say we had an H1 and we wanted to color it red. We would first put the name of the property, a colon, and then the value, which is red in this case, and then a semicolon. And then say we want to change the size of it, we can use a CSS property called font size, and it's the same thing. We would just put it on a new line and specify the size that we want for our font. Be sure to always remember a semicolon at the end. This is a common bug that beginners usually forget. If you find your style isn't working, this is generally because a semicolon is missing somewhere in your file. If we need to work on complex projects, there's one last thing we need to know, and that's how to combine CSS selectors together. Say we want to style an anchor tag with a class of test that lives inside of a p tag. So let's have a look at how we can select elements that are inside of other elements. And it's as easy as putting a space in between the two selectors. So we know that our anchor is inside of our paragraph, and to do this in the selector, we just do P space A. The space in this selector just means if there's any A's inside of a P, then it matches this selector. It doesn't have to be a direct child, it can be a grandchild or a child of a child of a child. If we wanted a direct child of the paragraph, we can use a right angle bracket instead of a space. Now what if we want to say that our anchor tag had a class? Now we can do that by saying a dot and then the class name, so a dot test. And those are just smushed together. So whenever a selector is bumped up right against it, it means that it belongs to the first selector. In our case, the anchor tag. So our final selector would look like P space A dot test, and then the curly braces to do all of our styling in. Just a note about specificity, the more selectors we use together, the more specific it becomes. Something like an A selector would be overwritten by P space A because it's more specific. Okay, now that we have the basics out of the way, we're going to get into our example project now. So to start off, we have an index.html file, and this just has the basic structure of the site. So we have a header, we have an about section, and we have our menu section. And we also are including a style.css file. Now this is just the basic structure of the site. We're going to work on a different file called example.css. And this is what it looks like currently. So to start off, we need to include our example.css into this file. And we're just going to follow suit of what we have here for the styles.css. I just hide that side panel. And in VS Code, you can do a shortcut by doing link:/CSS and hit tab. And then you just type in example.css. Now currently this is empty, but we could test to make sure it works. You can just do a background of red. Save it, and you'll notice it changes. Cool, so we're ready to get started. So the first thing we're going to do is modify the text for the entire site. So whatever the default font and color is going to be for the entire site. So we're going to put this in the body, and we're going to give it a color of 333, which is a dark gray color. Now why we're putting it in the body is because all content in HTML lives within the body. So if we style here, everything inside of it is going to pick up that color. Next, we're going to add a font family, and what this is the font. Now it's broken up into three things here, and how it works is the first one is the one that is the preferred font. Now not everyone has the same machine. Some people have a Mac, some have PC, some have Linux, and they all have different fonts installed on them. So this is a way of saying, okay, this is my preferred font. If you don't have that, then use the next one. If you don't have that, then use the next one. Now you'll see this one is in quotes. That's just because it has spaces in the name. You can put all of these in quotes if you want, but Generally speaking, you just put the ones with spaces in it, in between quotes. And this last one, serif here, is a bit of a special one. It's not actually a font name. It's the default serif font on your machine. So on Mac, it's going to be different than what it is on PC. There's also a sans serif if you prefer a sans serif font. So if I save this and refresh, you'll see it's a bit lighter. It's not black anymore, it's a darker gray, and it changed the font to Times New Roman. After that, we're going to modify the headings and change the font for that. So if I save this, you'll see the font is now Playfair. Now this isn't a font that's normally installed on people's machine. This is using Google Fonts. And how that works is if you go to fonts.google.com, you can select whichever font. We selected Playfair in this case, but just to show you how it works, you click on your font, you select the one that you want, and it gives you the code to put into your HTML and also the code to put in your CSS. Now you might have noticed the selector looks kind of funny because of all these commas in between. And that's just a way of linking several CSS selectors together. So I want this font family to be applied to an H1 and H2 and all the way through H6. Next, we're going to look at the spacing of the fonts. So let me just go back to here. You'll see how the text is right up against each other. So there's a CSS property called letter spacing, and you give it a value, a pixel value. Now there's different ways of giving spacing values within CSS, which I'm not going to get to in this video. For this purpose, we're going to use pixels because they're the easiest to understand. Just know that there are different units that you can work with. So if I were to save this, you'll see that the spacing in between here is a little wider than it was before. Now we're going to work on this big white area. We're going to fill this up with an image. So if you look at our HTML, you'll see this header here. This has a class of home. So we're going to use a CSS selector of .home. And then in there, we're going to use a CSS property called background image. And then in here, we're going to give it a URL to where the image is. In our case, we have an assets folder with a header.jpg. And if I were to save this, it adds the image. But you'll notice it looks kind of funky right now. That's just because the image itself is smaller than the box that it occupies. So what a background image does is it tiles it. So you'll see it's repeating here in 4 areas. So why don't we address that next? So there's a CSS property called background repeat, and you can choose to have it not repeat. So that gives us the one image, but you'll see it doesn't really take up the whole area anymore. So it looks kind of weird with our text being cut off here. To address this, we can use something called background size with a value of cover. And what this is going to do is scale the image up so that it covers the box that it's inside of, essentially. So it stretches it out. Now we want to create an effect where we scroll, the image will stay in place, but the rest of the site scrolls. And to do this, we have this property called background attachment with a value of fixed. Now when we save this, it got a bit larger because it's covering a larger area. I think it's covering like the entire screen because it's fixed. And when we scroll, you'll see that it sticks in place. Now, we want to move the cat up a bit because it looks like his chin's getting cut off there. And to do this, we can use a background position. There's actually a couple of them. There's background position X, and background position Y. So the Y just does the up and down, the X does left and right, and background position allows you to do both at the same time. But for this, we're just going to use background position. We're doing a negative 100 pixels. And the direction of Y, so 100 pixels, if I'm adding 100 pixels, it's moving it down. If I do a negative value, it's going to move it up. So if I save this, it shoves it up a bit so the face is a little more centered. So our title is a little hard to read right now against the background, So we're going to fix that. So if we look at our HTML, you'll see that our title is an H1. So we're going to do all of our styling for an H1. So what we have here is we're changing the color to white. We have our font size set to 42 pixels. And then our font weight, you see that the value is 400 here, and that's just how bold the text is, or the weight of the text. So 100 would be a thin font, and something like 900 would be a black font. It would be like really, really thick. So most of the time you can just put bold as your value, and that's perfectly fine. But for this, I just put 400 so that we can be a little more specific to the weight of the font. So if I save that, you'll see now it's a bit bigger, it's white, it's a little more bold. Next, we're going to look at the other headings. We got about catering, and we have our menu here. These are both H2s. So if you look at our code here, we have H2s for about catering, and we have our menu. So in our CSS, we're going to use the H2 selector. And what we're going to do is change the font size to 36, the font weight to bold, and the new CSS selector here is text align center. And you might be able to guess what this does. It centers it within the box that it's in. So if I hit save, you'll see that now it's centered inside of the box that it's in. And same with the menu down here. Next up, let's look at these. These are H3s. You'll see that in the menus, we have H3s all throughout. And then we also have an H3 underneath, or about catering. So all we're going to do with these, we're happy with the size of the font. We're just going to center them so that they're directly underneath the H2. So you'll see that they're centered and centered. And right now the paragraph text seems a little small to me. The lines of text seem kind of squished together to me. So there's not a lot of error in between those lines. So what we can do is P for paragraph. And if we look at our HTML, we have our paragraphs wrapping each of those. So I would save that. This has a font size of 18. And it does the line height of 27. So the line height is just specifying the space in between each line. Now in the design, our images are a bit lighter. They look a bit faded. Right now they're very punchy, which isn't a bad look, but for this design we had the images a little more faded. Since I have these images that I downloaded that are rather punchy, we're going to come back here. We're going to say all images. We're going to reduce its opacity. So how the opacity CSS property works is it's a value from 1 to 0, 1 being the most solid and 0 being the most transparent. And anything in between is a percentage. So I save that. And you'll see it's a little more faded. And one other thing in our design is the second paragraph we have in a lighter gray. So if you look in the index.html, I've wrap this in a class of text-gray. So we can come to our CSS and we can do .text-gray, and then we give it a color. Now you see the text is a lighter color than the default text, but you'll notice that it still has the same line spacing and font size, and that's because of cascading. So it took the properties from the P of the font size and the line height, and then it appended the color on top of it because it's a P tag with a class of text gray. So now, say we don't want our titles to be exactly the same in our menu section that it is in our about catering section. So we can override what the H3 styling that we already did specifically for the menu section. So how we can do that is, actually I'll show you the HTML first. So we have a class of menu, and then we have an H3. And in here we have a class of menu, and then any H3s inside the menu, we're going to change the font size. We're going to make it bold, and then we're going to text align it left. So if I hit save, you see now Now they're aligned left. And we can also do the same thing for the paragraphs. So you do this, we change the font size so it's a bit smaller, and we changed it so it's a lighter gray. You'll see that now it's a lighter gray and smaller. Now because this is the same color as our text gray, we could have very well gone through here and just added the class equals text gray, and that would work just the same, just for the purposes of keeping the HTML cleaner. I didn't do that, and we did it through CSS overrides essentially. One extra bonus tip for you to help practice your CSS selectors: if you go to any website and open the inspector, you right click and click inspect. If you hit Command F or Control F on Windows, down at the bottom you can type in CSS selectors and it'll show you what you're selecting. So if I type in .home, it highlights what I'm selecting. So if I .home space H1, you can see that I'm selecting the H1. Or if I do menu -P, and you can see I'm selecting the P inside of a menu. And you can also see there's 5 of them being selected. And you can toggle through them. That's a good way to practice your selectors. If you're not sure what you're doing in your CSS file, you can jump into Chrome, open the inspector, and then you can find which ones you want to select. CSS can take a bit to learn because there's a lot of CSS properties that you have to learn first and the concepts that go along with them. So I'm going to include a link in the description that goes through all the CSS properties and what they do. In future videos, we'll be covering more of the structure of how to build a website, and this one we just did the look and feel. If that's of interest to you, subscribe so you don't miss it. If you're still in the process of learning HTML, we have an HTML basic playlist that you can check out, and hopefully it'll help you out. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.